very much for coming, and if you came by train, I hope you got a seat. And if so, it makes you more qualified for high public office than Jeremy Corbyn. But now let's go on to what's important. We won the referendum. We won the referendum here in Bournemouth. We won the referendum in the Southwest. We won the referendum in the UK as a whole. If you look at it in terms of constituencies, over 500 parliamentary seats voted to leave. Without the UK Independence Party, the referendum would not have happened at all. So huge congratulations to everybody, and you all deserve a strong round of applause. But, and I'm afraid there is a but, we won the battle, we have yet to win the war. We could still find ourselves in a Brexit that is not really a Brexit, and that is absolutely against our national interest. The Kinnocks, Kenneth Clarke, Nick Clegg, the Loveys and the rest of them still want the UK to be a province in a protectionist European superstate. We must guard our victory. So I didn't hear that, actually. We must guard our victory. So at the risk of being a little technical and a little nerdy, which I don't think the other speeches will be, I'm now going to talk mostly about trade and trade agreements, which is my brief. So here's the first one. New Zealand's trade agreements. Now, trade agreements, although they are not necessary, they are desirable. While we remain in the EU, the United Kingdom, one of the biggest trading nations in the world, does not have the right, cannot sign trade agreements on its own behalf. To name just 3 countries, Chile, New Zealand, Iceland, all have the right to negotiate their own trade agreements precisely because they are not part of a trading bloc and specifically not part of the European Union. They are independent, we for the moment are not. And there is the list of New Zealand's trade agreements. It's an impressive list. It completely disproves and contradicts the proposition one hears all the time that a country has to be part of a big trading bloc in order to negotiate trade agreements. Chile, New Zealand, even Iceland, all have trade agreements with China. By comparison, the EU does not and will not anytime soon. There's a simple and compelling reason for this. It is actually easier and more straightforward to negotiate trade agreements for one single country and one single economy than attempting to do the same for a bloc of 28 countries with 28 different economies. The EU Trade Commissioner has to take into account and encompass the interests of all 28 member states, and that is difficult. In a metaphor I wish I'd come up with, but which Boris Johnson did, the EU in trade negotiations is rather like some gigantic 28-strong pantomime horse. It is ungainly, it doesn't go forward, and that's why it takes the EU 7 or 8 years to negotiate a trade agreement, or very often not at all. On Brexit, we in the UK would then negotiate our own trade agreements, and much more easily than the dysfunctional contraption that is the EU. Now, we're going to talk about access to the EU markets from which you hear complete rubbish spoken all the time, particularly on Newsnight. Despite what you hear, access to EU markets does not depend on having a trade agreement, far less on being an EU member state. Now, this slide shows the value of the trade between 20 countries outside the EU and the EU member states. By the way, it's imports plus exports. Somebody asked me this. The key figure is the one at the bottom, 2,720 billion euros. Now, numbers don't mean very much unless they're compared to something. So what is the comparative? The answer is the value of this trade imports plus exports by these 20 countries outside the European Union, and it is just 20 countries, was worth more than the entire economy of France, more than the entire economy here in the UK, and it was even more than what David Cameron and Samantha Cameron expect to earn next year. The fact is, a country does not have to be in the European Union in order to be able to trade with it and trade very successfully. Now, next fact, let's look at China's exports to the EU. This slide has been sent to the folks at the BBC, but perhaps unsurprisingly, it's yet to be seen. China, in goods alone, exports roughly 1.5 times what the United Kingdom exports to the EU. What we see here, and what the facts demonstrate, is that China, not an EU member and without a trade agreement with the EU, nevertheless has access sufficient to export more goods to the EU than we do in the UK, and to the tune of 1.5 times. Ah, but people say, as Philip Hammond wrote in a letter to the Daily Telegraph when I wrote him with this point, you're not mentioning services. Well, here is a slide showing the United States of America's exports of services to the EU compared with the UK's exports of services to the EU. As you'll see, it's the same thing. They export substantially more than we do. And here's another slide. This is the list of the top 10 exporters to the EU. And the key point here is that the top 3, China, Russia and the United States, 6 of the top 10 and 11 of the top 20 trading countries do not have trade agreements with the European Union. The facts are clear. People and businesses do not need to be in a country which has a trade agreement with the EU in order to trade very successfully and very profitably and have access to the EU markets. These countries all trade with the EU within the framework and under the rules of the World Trade Organization, and that is one option for the UK on Brexit that is always available. Now, one further nerdy academic fact. At the moment, because we are in the EU, our seat on the World Trade Organization is in abeyance. It has a sort of observer status. The moment that we leave the European Union, we can reactivate our seat. We would then re-establish our full rights, and we can then speak up for UK trade and the UK national interest. Until we leave, our voice there is submerged as one of 28. Now we have a list of the EU's trade agreements. This is the second last slide. This is the Steve Crowther point. Steve was a brilliant chair of UKIP for 6 long years, and I'm much looking forward to hearing his speech. To give full recognition, Steve made this point to me. Perhaps you cannot see the detail easily on the screen, but to be fair, the EU has, for example, a trade agreement with Peru, with Chile, the Republic of Madagascar, Costa Rica, the Seychelles, and so on and so on. The EU, in short, has over 100 trade agreements. In fact, we make it 141. Now, there is a conclusion from this. It will be very odd, not to say absurd, not to say bizarre, and, this is the key point, not to say wholly against the commercial interests of the EU, given all the countries that do have trade agreements with the EU, for the EU not to have one with the UK on Brexit. Thanks, Steve, for pointing that out to me. Now let's look at free movement of people, and this is the last slide. Free movement, what they call free movement, is simply what gives over 450 million citizens of EU member states the absolute right to live, work and settle in the United Kingdom. We have no control. Now, as we've seen, the EU has all these trade agreements, and these trade agreements, with one exception, which I'll come to, do not, repeat, not have a free movement clause. For example, there's no free movement clause in the EU's trade agreements with Mexico, South Korea, or the one with Canada. The EU even has trade agreements with 10 European countries with no free movement clause. Turkey even managed to be in the customs union without free movement. It's only the 4 EFTA countries, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Iceland and Norway, whose specific and particular trade agreement with the EU requires free movement of people. Of these 4, Liechtenstein has a derogation, and Switzerland voted against free movement in a referendum in February 2014, which, by the way, we never hear about. So that leaves 2 countries, and this is the point I'm coming to. This is the key point. That leaves 2 countries. Out of all the countries in the world, it's only Norway and Iceland, who are in the middle there, who still have free movement of people in return for access in a trade agreement with the EU. There is no EU requirement on other countries for free movement in trade agreements. There is no EU requirement for free movement of people in return for access to the single market. None. Not at all. Not at all. This is a simple, basic, obvious and incontrovertible fact. But what we hear on the BBC is always the reverse. And let's explore this. I wonder if anybody here has ever watched Yes Prime Minister and/or Yes Minister. These shows demonstrate, probably be better than anything, the incipient power of the civil service. As a resident of the South West, I can strongly recommend Devon clotted cream fudge. But we do not want and cannot accept a Brexit fudge cooked up by Sir Humphrey. And incidentally, we did win, and there's been an honours list that David Cameron did, but I wanted just a few modifications. Will Straw, who ran the Remain campaign, was made a CBE. Well, that's not enough. He should have been made an Earl, at the very least, but for services to Brexit and the Leave campaign. George Osborne was made a companion of honour. It should have been a companion of dishonour. And for Paddy Ashdown, Mark Carney and Tony Blair, they should all be made dukes. And given their prognostications of doom, they should all be the same title, the Dukes of Hazzard. To go back to Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, these were co-written by Sir Anthony Jay, who passed away just recently, who worked for the BBC as far back as the 1960s. He wrote about his time then. We in the BBC were not just anti-Harold Macmillan. We were anti-industry, anti-capitalism, anti-advertising, anti-selling, anti-profit, anti-patriotism, anti-monarchy, anti-police, anti-armed forces, anti-bomb, anti-authority. This is Anthony Jay writing. Almost anything that made the world a freer, safer and more prosperous place, you name it, we in the BBC were anti-it. That was the 1960s. Well, the BBC were biased then, and the BBC is biased now. And in 2016, we can add that the BBC are also anti-Brexit, anti the UK Independence Party, and personally anti-Nigel Farage. And I do want to take this moment to praise unreservedly Nigel Farage's calm, courage, bravery, and above all, eloquence in the face of the BBC's onslaught. There was a concerted campaign of systematic abuse by the BBC and their fellow travellers of journalism, of which they should all be thoroughly ashamed, and the time has come for it to stop. In conclusion, the last word should go, I think, to Shakespeare. It's only 2 sentences, by the way. In one of his less well-known plays, there is this great phrase, that England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. That was happening while we remained in the EU, and in the referendum, that was what the British people voted against. So finally, I talked about honours, but seriously, there should be a new British Medal of Freedom, of which Nigel Farage should be the first recipient. And finally, I didn't talk about bank holidays, but on June the 23rd should be a new public holiday, Independence Day. Thank you very much.